He wrote some of the most gripping music ever written, inventing a bunch of techniques and his own notation along the way. But eventually he realized that this was unsustainable and sought ways of incorporating tradition while still taking advantage of as many novel sounds as he could muster. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Krzysztof Penderecki. Penderecki was born in November 1933 as the middle child of Tadeusz and Zofia Penderecki. Tadeusz was a lawyer who managed to survive World War II. German forces killed 70% of Poland's lawyers. Before Krzysztof, the Pendereckis never had any professional musicians in their family, but music was a major pastime in their house. Tadeusz would join his brothers in playing string quartets, and may have, at one point, received a violin as payment for taking a case for which his client could not pay. Krzysztof experienced some piano lessons, and after World War II, Tadeusz bought him a violin, on which he made immediate progress. While he initially wanted to be a painter or a sculptor, Krzysztof was becoming more and more focused on the violin, and decided to study music in Krakow in 1951. Although Penderecki was unable to fully enroll when he got there because preference was given to Poles of lower class origins, he was able to study violin and rudimentary composition. He breezed through a 5-year curriculum in 2 years and then spent the next 4 at the Krakow Academy of Music. After just 1 year at the academy, Penderecki put down his violin for good and devoted himself entirely to composition. His first teacher there was Artur Malawski, who died while Penderecki was studying with him. After graduating, the academy immediately gave him a class to teach, and he moonlighted at a local seminary because his knowledge of ancient church music was so broad. Penderecki's student compositions, like his 3 miniatures for clarinet and piano, are competent but nothing to write home about. These early pieces, he said, were designed to solve particular compositional problems, and Penderecki admitted to doing the traditional student thing of trying on this style or that style and seeing what fit. He matured very quickly as a young composer, and when the League of Polish Composers announced a prize, it was Penderecki whose anonymous scores finished first, second, and third. From there he went from height to height. And from an early age, Penderecki mastered the unique performance instructions and characteristic notations that would define much of his music. And this was a rare level of artistic freedom in the Eastern Bloc. Polish composers, while they were nominally instructed to write in the conservative socialist realism aesthetic initially pushed forward by Stalin's Soviet Union, they didn't really go through with it because the Polish regime's threats were empty, a rarity in the Eastern Bloc. While the government wanted its composers and artists to write music and create art in this conservative idiom, the artists themselves resented this directive. Actually, the government's official position probably increased the number of composers who were trying to write in avant-garde styles just to stick it to the man. What the government could do was block art they didn't like. Bartók was one of the few composers let through Poland's portion of the Iron Curtain due to his use of folk tunes, on the grounds that those techniques glorified the working class. Penderecki also knew quite a bit about the music of Igor Stravinsky, but only discovered the Second Viennese School by way of a Webern string quartet and Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw in 1957. This was possible because October 1956 brought about a liberalization set up by the death of Joseph Stalin 3 years earlier, his successor Nikita Khrushchev's many reforms, and the death of Polish leader Bolesław Bierut, who was widely thought of as Poland's answer to Stalin. An intra-party power struggle resulted in Poland becoming less of a satellite state to the USSR, even if they were still solidly a part of the Eastern Bloc. Bierut's successor, Władysław Gomułka, did indeed institute changes and reforms for a while, but would revert to more oppressive control as he sought to retain power. Immediately that same year, the Warsaw Autumn Music Festival was founded, which provided the largest and freest festival for new music in the Eastern Bloc. It was certainly the most prestigious. It's why Ligeti has an etude entitled Autumn in Warsaw. It was named after the festival. Penderecki broke onto the festival's scene with Strophes from 1959, which showed hints of his later work. In the score, Penderecki provides dotted lines representing different tempi, and drew a thick line to show how the tempo speeds up and slows down over time. This is much more practical and straightforward and efficient than continually using tempo markings. He also explored wildly fluctuating playing techniques, especially on the string instruments, which makes sense since he started out on the violin. He'd know the ins and outs of string technique. Strophes got picked up first in West Germany, where it made its way further west to the Domaine Musicale concerts of Pierre Boulez, who had explored a similar avant-garde sound world in his Les Marteaux sans Maître just 4 years prior. However, Penderecki himself didn't count strophes as part of his career. He said that he'd written that before he began developing his language. I don't want to go against the composer here, but I kind of disagree with that, because you can see a through line from strophes through the rest of his work. See, Penderecki's avant-garde bona fides rest pretty strongly on his string writing, and we can trace this from strophes through the percussion and string orchestra piece Anaklassis through to his most famous piece. From a very early age, Penderecki had a keen sense of freedom, and that liberty was the most essential human right. As a teenager, he got in trouble for writing anti-Stalin slogans in his school bathroom, and he recalled his shock and horror from watching behind closed doors as Poland's Jews were rounded up and taken away by the Nazis. Following from that, it makes sense that Penderecki went on to write the famous Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima in 1960. He was originally inclined to simply title the piece 837 after how long it was supposed to be, a la John Cage, but ended up calling it Threnody and adding its subtitle dedication after witnessing its premiere and realizing that, in order to submit it to a UNESCO competition in France, it had to come across as more socially relevant. The piece's fame rests on its title and its biting dissonances that result from a collection of extended techniques and unconventional notation, which Elliott Carter praised for its anti-artistic and primitive qualities, which he thought would give the piece a wide appeal. We have to keep in mind, though, that Penderecki didn't start out just to write a threnody. He set out to write an experimental piece that used these techniques, and when he heard it, he was struck by how powerful it struck his emotions. I use the word struck a little bit too much. After this, he went on to write Polymorphia, yet another string ensemble piece, which takes notation to its limits. In strophes onward, he wrote less and less conventionally until he ended up with graphic scores that look like EEGs because they were EEGs. They represent the brain waves of people who had heard Threnody. Penderecki was volunteering at the Krakow Medical Center, whose EEG machines inspired this notation. Pieces in the late 50s and early 60s were composed in the Café Michalika, a famous Art Nouveau restaurant in Krakow. He didn't like solitude when composing and felt the danger of being interrupted was a worthy trade-off. So what's he trying to do with this notation? Well, Penderecki's focus was on timbre, the character and texture of the sounds. His colleagues were obsessive over things like pitch in the case of the hardcore serialists, or rhythm in the case of someone like Olivier Messiaen. But Penderecki organized music through the sounds he could get out of instruments. This meant a deep and detailed focus on playing techniques, which required a new way of notating them as his ideas matured. Pitch in Penderecki really isn't all that important except to get a timbre. A really high note on a violin is going to have a different timbre than something really low and scratchy on the G string. Since Penderecki was so interested in timbre and really high notes have a particular timbre, he came up with something like this. A triangular note head to indicate that the performer is to play the highest note that they can on their instrument. He uses as much traditional notation as he can to communicate what he wants to performers. Contrast this with Ligeti, who was exploring similar techniques in sound masses and tone clusters, but the difference was that Ligeti still wanted total control over all the inner voices, leading to scores of unwieldy size and a lot more rehearsal time to get everything right. Ligeti was able to notate this, which he called micropolyphony, using traditional notation. But to say that this is unwieldy in comparison to what Penderecki was doing is an understatement. Looking at pitch in Penderecki is a fruitless exercise because there are bits of structure. For instance, he will chromatically saturate a gesture or a melodic line by including all of the notes within a particular range at least once. Like the serial composers, Penderecki was interested in exploring the 12-tone aggregate, that is, all pitches of the chromatic scale, but he rejected the idea that you had to approach this in any kind of organized and systematic way. He identified the Threnodies middle section as serial, but looking at pitch just isn't interesting. Most analyses of these Penderecki pieces tend to, if not disregard pitch, they'll sideline it in a way that's kind of refreshing to see, because so many other composers and analysts of the 20th century are so concerned with pitch that it becomes all that anybody ever wants to talk about. Penderecki forces us to contend with other parameters. Good analysis tends to group chunks of Penderecki's music into one of somewhere between 4 and 10 categories of sound, using these as a formal description of a piece, and then only sketching in broad terms what happens within these sections. The discrepancies in category organization depends on how broad or narrow your categories are, and all smaller things, like if you assume that silence indicates a distinction between two different sections. Now back to Polymorphia, which is, for my money, one of the funniest pieces I know. Not because it's like goofy throughout or anything, but in its totality. It becomes a kind of massive retrospective joke because he puts in some of the wildest string sounds you could ever imagine. I mean, the Bavarian State Orchestra initially refused to play Polymorphia on the grounds that its techniques would damage their instruments. They weren't entirely wrong. Then, after at least 8 or 9 minutes of this, there's a pause, and then a big ol' C major chord. Penderecki thought of this as something of an experiment in effectively ending very wildly atonal pieces with tonal chords. And he did this by constructing the immediately preceding music as not just some random quarter tone cluster, but one specifically spaced, such that it called for some kind of resolution. Does it work? Up to you. It's always struck me as a funny choice for its irony, but it could very well be that Penderecki had gone so far with his string techniques that there was nowhere to go from Polymorphia. Sure, there was the string quartet, but that was just introducing these techniques to chamber music, where he could no longer avail himself of sound masses by, having a whole section and playing a quarter tone cluster. For Penderecki, the next big step was to move out of his string wheelhouse and apply these techniques outwards until he expanded into the full orchestra. And he did this with fluorescences, which expanded the orchestral sound to include an alarm and a typewriter. Penderecki called this liberated sound. This is very similar to Edgard Varèse's ideas that all sound could be music, and John Cage's ideas that all sound was music. Penderecki fits in neatly in the amorphous space between these two ideologies. And these pieces are collectively known as his sonoristic pieces. And sonorism as an aesthetic movement went beyond Penderecki into some of his Polish contemporaries. Composers like Lutosławski, Sieroцki, and Górecki made extensive use of string instruments along somewhat similar lines. The sense of controlled randomness within certain sections of music is very similar to Lutosławski's techniques as seen in Venetian Games, which he wrote a year after Penderecki's Threnody. But Penderecki went further, because he didn't think in terms of pitch or harmonic organization. Instead, he sketched out a piece architecturally, as graphs and boxes that determined the shape of sound within a section or over the course of an entire piece. Only after this process was completed did Penderecki turn his attention to the details of executing this or that section in the most straightforward way. This is the style of music that most people associate with Penderecki, horror movie stuff. Johnny Greenwood of the band Radiohead has been a huge Penderecki fan since his college days, emphasizing the visceral and communicative power of live performances. Such is Greenwood's connection to Penderecki that he produced a joint album with the Threnody and Polymorphia paired with his own musical responses. Because he was so interested in timbre, Penderecki made early attempts to serialize timbre through a matrix of physical materials found in the orchestra: metal, wood, leather, hair, and felt, which are grouped into resonators and exciters based on if they made the noise or if they just got the noise going. Serializing this meant trying to equalize this matrix of timbres. It was about defining a limited set of possibilities and then exhausting that complete set without privileging or underprivileging any one of them. So if you need more metal-on-metal sounds to achieve an equal balance between all of these potential combinations of exciters and resonators, you're forced to consider instruments as arrangements of physical materials. So playing directly on the piano strings with a triangle rod or a small cymbal was just an effort to get another metal-on-metal sound into a piece that needed more of it. Penderecki abandoned this attempt at timbre serialization by the mid-1960s, as it had done its job and forced him to consider all possibilities of new sounds. He was, after all, a string player, and his experiments in working in recording studios and with electronic equipment propelled him to create a new sound world inspired by the sounds he heard and the techniques he was fiddling with. He worked in the electronic studio for a while, but he felt constrained by how long it took to produce a single sound. He said that he'd be better off with an orchestra to make the sounds that he wanted. It wasn't his intent, he would later say, to destroy all that had come before. Unlike other contemporary streams of thought, such as that of the polemical Boulez, whose contention was essentially that serial music was the only way that you could write good Western art music, Penderecki wasn't hardline in his belief that his way was the only way of the future. He begged no one to follow him. One of Penderecki's biggest notational innovations was his systematic use of an approximate notation where second markings are ticked off in a score, and any events that happen between these are only approximately notated. This provides a semblance of tempo and a framework for coordinating an ensemble. Meter and pulse are completely ambiguous, if not outright destroyed. So one yardstick I like to use when coming up against notation like this is to ask myself the question, does it have to be notated like this? And in Penderecki's case, yes. Attempting to put this, from the first string quartet, into a traditional bar line framework would render a score of enormous complexity. His notation is superior in two ways. It gets across his desired effect, and it allows for greater subtleties of deviation between performances. If written new complexity style like this, performers would take a lot more time to rehearse, and the end result would be rigid, which is worse. The chances of any two performers playing at exactly the same time using this notation is pretty low. Even for a more common technique, senza misura, the abandonment of a metrical structure for a free lyrical measure, he found a novel shorthand. The next major piece was his St. Luke Passion, which represents Penderecki as the height of his powers. While pieces like Threnody and Polymorphia represent avant-garde experimentalism in different stages, the effects in the St. Luke are always aimed towards a visceral and expressive goal. Sonorism alone was never going to be the key to writing a truly large-scale piece like he wanted to. He needed other techniques. His atone language and use of extended techniques emphasize the grittiness and otherworldly terror of the Passion narrative. This is especially true for the choir, which takes the role of the mob, hissing and jeering. Because of the power of this extra musical narrative, it's easier for listeners to get a sense of Penderecki's language, and I think the St. Luke Passion is the single best entry point if you want to understand and appreciate Penderecki's avant-garde style. He chose the St. Luke Passion in part because Bach didn't tackle it, but imbued it with all sorts of references to Bach, from the famous BACH motif to the choice of a baritone to portray Jesus. However, the idea of it being a strictly St. Luke Passion is a bit of a misnomer, because Penderecki took texts from all different parts of the scripture. He would often pause work on the Passion, which he composed piecemeal over the course of several years, in order to fulfill incidental commissions. And this piece is truly huge. It took 7 weeks of work just to copy the score out, and when he finished it in early 1966, he dedicated it to his new wife, Elżbieta. On its premiere at the end of March in that year, Penderecki achieved wider fame than that which these new music festivals could afford. Anyone there immediately recognized that they had heard a modern masterpiece. Despite calling for huge forces for over an hour, replete with his unusual arsenal of strenuous playing techniques, the Passion was performed hundreds of times across the world. As the new music world is still wont to do, though, the public success of the Passion was seen by some as an indication that Penderecki was something of a sellout, like, how dare he include Gregorian chant in this mostly really super atonal piece. People frequently hear a certain Gregorian quality to the vocal writing in the Passion, but this is purely a matter of how the lines are constructed and inflected. The very fast and loose 12-tone writing that Penderecki uses privileges smaller intervals, and he weaves a melody together in a way that sounds pretty Gregorian, even though no chant is ever quoted directly. The Passion also ends, like Polymorphia, on a tonal triad, this time E major and not C. But Penderecki learned from his mistakes and wove just enough tonality into the Passion to give that last chord a sense of unity with the rest of the work. He achieves this by using pedal tones to settle on certain sonorities. He exploits the salient extremes of register and includes bits of melody that we hear and understand tonally. The Stabat Mater does the same thing, as he arranges a penultimate cluster to resolve to D major. Consistently then, Penderecki liked to find ways of ending atonal pieces with tonal triads, with ever-increasing levels of success. Penderecki also wanted to set the sequel to the Passion narrative, which traditionally ends with Christ's death on the cross. Utrenia, his next major work after the Passion, sets the next two parts of the Gospel narrative, his entombment and resurrection. Its title is pulled from the Russian Orthodox tradition's morning prayer service, and instead of his preferred Latin or a mix of source languages, he chose Old Church Slavonic, which is sort of the Russian Orthodox equivalent to the Catholic Church's use of Latin. He traveled all over Slavic lands to hear these services rendered firsthand. Penderecki loved so many different things that it wasn't clear to him that music was his fated profession. Had he lived his life over, he may have ended up a botanist or an expert in some completely other field. The broad success of the Passion in the West led the Polish government to approve Penderecki's appointment at the Folkwang College in Essen, West Germany, as a composition teacher. Penderecki never used examples of his own music, and held the belief shared by many that composition cannot truly be taught. His view is that you can only analyze pieces that you like and learn from them. His students, though, felt like they learned a lot from him, but he didn't feel like teaching was helping his composition or creative work in any way. The Passion also sparked a flurry of commissions, such that he had more than enough to work on at any one time. He made a habit of taking more commissions than he knew he'd be able to fulfill, in order to force him to keep writing every day and stay in practice. Among the most prestigious was a commission from the UN, who asked for a piece to celebrate their 25th anniversary, a piece he called Cosmogony, which, in typical style, pulls from a multitude of text sources to tell a grand story of heaven and earth. One through line through his works is his impulse to commemorate tragedy, from the Threnody through the Passion. Auschwitz was not far from his hometown. This was the impulse behind his much shorter oratorio, Dies Irae. All the same, he was perfectly capable of tongue-in-cheek humor, as in his solo capriccio for the cellist Siegfried Palm in 1968, not to be confused with the capriccio for violin and orchestra written a year prior, or later capriccio for tuba. There's also a capriccio for oboe and strings from 1965. I'm starting to think that this guy had a favorite go-to title for fun works. By this point in Penderecki's career, trying to go piece by piece would just bog down the narrative. So if I skip over talking about your favorite piece, I apologize deeply and profoundly, and you can please submit your complaints by contacting me telepathically. In any event, the practice of biting off more than he could chew, and often leaving his performers and part writers scrambling at the very last minute to put a performance together, was pretty common. He thrived under this last-minute pressure, even when this caused excessive stress in those around him, due to lack of adequate preparation time. This may have been a factor in the initial failure of his opera The Devils of Loudun at its Hamburg premiere, which was due to the discrepancy between Penderecki's music and the staging choices. When it was performed 2 days later in Stuttgart, the production matched the music and it was much better received. Whether or not a production succeeds or fails depends almost entirely on how daring the staging choices are. In October 1971, Penderecki made his public premiere as a conductor in front of the International Free Jazz Orchestra with his jazz piece Actions. His conducting was superb, even though he had never taken lessons, although it would take him 2 years to finally conduct a piece that he did not compose. Jazz was a natural fit for Penderecki, who heard the unusual playing techniques and controlled improvisations of the medium and dovetailed it into his own style. The following year, his Krakow alma mater, the State Academy of Music, convinced Penderecki to serve as its director. Penderecki didn't take this lightly. He was determined to be a truly transformative director, insisting on reforms and overseeing their instantiation, all alongside hand-picked deputies who would make sure that everything ran smoothly during his long trips abroad to attend this or that performance, premiere, or festival. Such was Penderecki's international demand that the Chicago Lyric Opera, to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States, passed over every living American composer and commissioned Penderecki for a new work. Understandably, this upset the many American composers who felt slighted. The eventual opera, Paradise Lost, was delayed by Penderecki's typical busyness, as well as family sicknesses and death. Another unusual commission story concerns his First Symphony, a work that divided the critics of the day, which was paid for by the Perkins Engines Company. This was a semi-regular thing for them. They'd commission a piece and they'd hire an orchestra to play it, but it's so weird to think of any corporation doing that today. The funny part is that Penderecki absolutely loved cars. He liked the symphony as a form, he never liked writing short pieces, but he waited a while to write his first one because he felt like a composer had to be at least 40 before they were mature enough to write a work of, well, that kind of maturity without having to rely on a text. As 1976 turned into 1977, Penderecki was still working on Paradise Lost as well as a violin concerto, which subverted all expectations. Gone were the techniques of integrating noise into the orchestra that made Penderecki so famous. Instead, it's a one-movement, 40-minute work that pulls far more from the romantic violin concerto tradition than anything from his past catalog. Premiering soloist Isaac Stern said that he'd given the most important premiere in the genre since Alban Berg's. And when the 3-hour Paradise Lost was finally premiered in Chicago, it too came with a hefty dose of the neo-romantic. By his Second Symphony, known as a Christmas Symphony due to its quotations of Silent Night, it appeared as though the once staunch avant-garde liberator of sound had turned his back on the whole past century. He would go on to write 8 of a planned 9 symphonies and only really got going symphonically in the late 1980s. The Second Symphony proved the most retrospective piece for a long while. Dabbling in that tradition post-Second Symphony, it contained a certain degree of tension between the past and the present, or maybe a glimpse into a kind of alternative music history where events unfolded differently after the late Romantic. It took until 1980 for Penderecki to appear in the Soviet Union. Penderecki had become quite known for his interpretations of the Shostakovich symphonies, and his first invitation to conduct in the USSR came after an incident in West Germany, when Tikhon Khrennikov asked Friedrich Hummel why Shostakovich wasn't performed in West Germany. Hummel said that no, he actually was, quite often, but Penderecki wasn't ever invited to the USSR, and if they were as serious in the Soviet Union about Shostakovich as they claimed to be, that was a real oversight. So why the love of Shostakovich? Aside from any extra musical or personal connections, Penderecki cited Shostakovich as a friend. There's a similarity between Shostakovich's signature DSCH motif and the Polish hymn Holy God, which Penderecki used in his Polish Requiem. Could it be that there's something about Shostakovich's language that sounded somehow Polish to Penderecki? Shostakovich was also one of the last survivors of a romantic symphonic tradition that Penderecki felt it was important to carry on. He also conducted other late symphonists, Bruckner, Sibelius, and Prokofiev, but Shostakovich was the only composer of the many he conducted whose career overlapped with his own. And when he guest conducted a piece that wasn't his own, it would always be from one of these symphonists that he liked. The idea of being a full-time conductor never appealed to him. He understood the emancipation of sound, which is a big thing in his avant-garde days, as having a long history within the symphonic form, not something he just came up with. He cited Tchaikovsky's handling of tone color as an example. Analysts and musicologists get so wound up in the pitch and rhythm details, the stuff you can see on a page, that we can lose track of the most important part of music, which is how it sounds, and how those sounds translate into how we feel. For Penderecki, musical grammars may come and go, but the essence of what makes great music is something deeper than the surface-level rules it follows. Even in Fluorescences, written a year after the Threnody, he devotes over 2 minutes of music to various timbral fluctuations on a single note. Penderecki foregrounds timbre by taking away the changes of pitch that might otherwise distract us. Yet even before its first performance, Penderecki knew that Fluorescences was a balance sheet of his years of experimentation. He didn't think he could go any further in juicing any more new sounds out of the orchestra. He could have written 100 Threnodies, he said. He just didn't want to. The avant-garde, Penderecki said, offered an illusion of universality, and of liberation from old ways, but soon regarded many of his fellow artists as figures who were far more interested in tearing things down and not building anything new up. And he was called the Trojan horse of the Avant-Garde for his understanding that the experiments of the 1960s were unsustainable. Truly revolutionary music was, ironically, very limited, because as soon as you do something a couple of times, it ceases to be revolutionary, and you've got to start the hunt for something new and something novel and something shocking all over again. A true piece of music, he said, could not consist of clusters and unpleasant noises, because those things couldn't be arranged in a way that made sense, and it would just bore audiences after a couple of minutes. He always held that composers were there to communicate and to entertain, regardless of the era they found themselves in. Bach and Mozart, he said, knew their audiences. They knew who they were writing for, and contemporary composers didn't have that luxury. He saw a distance between composers and their audiences, and believed that looking back to the Romantic era was the best way of healing that gap, saying that composers who didn't use melodies were not composers at all. Younger composers who felt unconvinced by the atonal mid-century dogma could be inspired by Penderecki to go their own paths and not care so much about the peer pressure. But even as he moved away from the shocking sounds of his sonorist past, he was still looking for new sounds. 1973's Canticum Canticorum Salomonis, a Song of Song setting, originally called for large seashells, but when this became impractical, he substituted them for ocarinas. Penderecki so loved the ocarina timbre that he used it again in The Dream of Jacob, another biblical work, and in Paradise Lost, an opera which frames its story as one told by its author, Milton, who is also the character who opens the opera. Or in Penderecki's terms, Paradise Lost isn't an opera, it's a spiritual representation, which alludes to the plays of that name that trace their origin to 1400s Florence and died out in 1600, succumbing to the then new form of opera. Characters in Paradise Lost are assigned characteristic intervals, which dominate their melodies, and characteristic timbres as well, which allows Penderecki a great deal of freedom and formal clarity, because it's 3 hours long. For his choral 7th Symphony from 1996, subtitled The Seven Gates of Jerusalem to celebrate the 3000th year of that city, Penderecki invented an instrument called the tubaphone, long plastic pipes designed to act as deep-pitched percussion. It wasn't his desire to come up with a new instrument. He just had this sound in mind, similar to that of the Australian Aboriginal didgeridoo, and he had no other way of making it real. So even in this neotonal period, it's not like he completely turned his back on the search for new sounds. He was a realist, in that you weren't likely to get anything new out of old instruments. He has a lot of religious works, but his most profound and moving religious works tend to be from the New Testament. Not just the Passion and Utrenia, but also a Magnificat setting that was understood by its listeners in a political context. The unearthly sounds that Penderecki could coax out of an orchestra when applied to sacred music gives them an aura of power and deep, terrifying mystery. The Magnificat setting prompted a 10-minute sermon from Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, applying the Magnificat texts to the need for religious and secular freedoms of all sorts. Penderecki would later compose an Agnus Dei setting upon learning of the cardinal's death. Penderecki identified the Magnificat as the last piece written in his first style, which had started all the way back with the Threnody. The triple fugue in the Magnificat was the pinnacle of complexity, with over 50 contrapuntal voices, and he didn't have interest in writing more complicated music. As a nod to practicality, he knew that the Magnificat, as well as the Canticum Canticorum, were almost impossible to perform because of the number of quarter tones. The intersection of politics and religion was continued in his Lacrimosa, commissioned by Lech Wałęsa and the Independent Solidarity Trade Union to commemorate the victims of the 1970 protests on the Baltic city of Gdansk. Solidarity would grow to encompass a huge chunk of the Polish people, and was instrumental in the downfall of the communist regime in 1989. The Agnus Dei and Lacrimosa were incorporated into his Polish Requiem, doubtless a reference entitled to Brahms' German Requiem, with each of its sections dedicated to lost Polish lives. Like Brahms' example, the Catholic Requiem Mass only serves as a point of departure. Penderecki swaps out traditional sections for those that are more definitively evocative of Polish patriotism, and ends the work with a brand new finale. Penderecki would update the Polish Requiem in 1993, and again in 2005, after the death of Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope in the church's history, making this piece a malleable memorial to the greatest Poles who had ever lived and died. This bookended that papal reign, as Penderecki's Te Deum was a celebration of his friend Cardinal Karol Wojtyła's election as Pope John Paul II, which is, frankly, a much easier name to try to say. Once Penderecki had found his mature neo-romantic style, he was able to produce pieces at a much faster clip considering his barrage of international commitments. Too many pieces to give ample time to any one of them here in this video. These include 2 other operas from the late 80s and early 90s called The Black Mask and King Ubu, an additional 6 symphonies written somewhat out of order between 1988 and 2017, 20 more choral pieces, 13 original orchestral works, and 13 other concertante works, in addition to other arrangements and extractions of larger pieces that round up both of those 2 latter categories. By the year 2000, Penderecki was taking on as many as 60 concerts per year. And this also coincided with a renewed interest in chamber music, especially in the 21st century. Penderecki noted that he felt more drawn to its economy of means. As his style evolved to embrace the neotonal, his beliefs on the power of music within society shifted also. Powerful, evocative avant-garde sounds evoked equally strong emotions in listeners, which he had used effectively to communicate tragedy. His more tonal music was written primarily for himself, as he rejected the idea that music could be a social force. Tradition became more important to him as he got older. Without tradition, he could never have written pieces like The Passion, which are still quite modern. Penderecki's neo-romantic brand was in reviving the concerto, which had largely been abandoned, as 20th century composers sought ever more complete breaks from tradition. There's also an inherent foreground and background hierarchy of soloist versus orchestra, and this didn't play well with serialism's drive towards equality across all possible musical dimensions. As melodic and consonant as his neo-romantic music can be, he resisted the idea that it was tonal, because there was no systematic relation or hierarchy between the chords that one finds in tonal music. In the 21st century, Penderecki regarded music as marked by decline due to a lack of new ideas developing. Composers were all turning back to the past without wanting to move forward. His metaphor, and how he saw his music in his place, was that of a tree, rooted in the past, but stretching out to the future in new, multifaceted ways. He always held hope that the next and newest generation would find that new path. He felt that music hadn't progressed since the invention of the saxophone, because composers just kept on writing for the same instruments. He said in A Century of Landing on the Moon, why was it that composers were stuck writing for museum pieces? Penderecki died in March 2020, at the age of 86, after a prolonged illness. And with the pandemic in its earliest stages, there was no way to put on a memorial concert to the greatest Polish composer of his generation. His fans had to mourn him from home. With his passing, the title of greatest living Polish composer is now once again up for debate. Penderecki was a deeply multifaceted man. His home was covered in a mishmash of objects across cultures and centuries, from a huge clock collection and various Russian Orthodox icons from the 14 through the 1600s. He spoke over half a dozen languages, and his library was primarily books not about music, and he didn't like to talk about the subject as much as all of his other varied interests, especially his interest in religion and philosophy. He wondered, what did people believe, and why were they so keen to believe what they believed? Religion was very important for Penderecki, and he relied on his Christian faith to cope with the traumatic events of his lifetime. He called himself a left-wing Catholic, and he believed in religion's moral and social teachings, and didn't really get involved with its petty political aspects. Poland under communism was strictly atheist, but the young Penderecki had grown up on the Bible. However, Poland's brand of one-party communist rule, as we heard earlier, was more relaxed than the hardline Soviet Union and East Germany that surrounded them, who refused to even so much as acknowledge Penderecki's existence until a smattering of performances began in 1972, which proved a big year in the development of relations between Western and Eastern blocs more broadly. Penderecki's religiosity, his lack of affiliation with a communist party, and his affiliations with the West, all three of these would have put him under the crosshairs of other regimes, but there was a trade-off. He was, after all, Poland's biggest cultural export. The Poles were really proud of their famous national composer, even if they really couldn't tell you the first thing about what his music sounded like. The Polish government even officially honored him on his 50th birthday, citing the cross-class appeal of his music and his international fame. He accepted, and when the West German press attacked him for accepting it, Penderecki was clear. He knew that the government knew that he didn't agree with them, which is why he felt he had to accept. It was a much-needed show of Polish unity at a time when the country was so bitterly divided. When in Krakow, he composed in the early mornings when the city was at its least busy, and as a consequence got most of his creative work done away from home. Then again, he was away from home more than he was at home anyway. In the winter, he would escape to Krynica in the south, and the summers on the Baltic Sea. He was so busy that he often only had time for about a half hour of diligent compositional work per day. If he hadn't had so many functions to attend, you gotta wonder how much more prolific he would have been. Penderecki also never liked the piano. He always heard its pure equal temperament as out of tune with the tuning ebbs and flows of an orchestra, especially his very familiar string sections, and he hated the chamber setup of solo string instrument accompanied by piano. On the other hand, he quite liked the organ and wished he'd written more for it, likely because it's so rare to find organs that are in equal temperament. At one point, he shunned the idea of writing a piano concerto entirely, but lo and behold, he wrote one in the early 2000s. He never wrote a solo piano work, although an authorized transcription of 3 selections, arranged and recompiled, was put together in March of 2019. He authorized a piece for solo piano, and then a year later he died. Don't know what that tells you. Penderecki's career encapsulated the biggest problem in experimental art. Pieces like the Threnody and the St. Luke Passion are some of those rare pieces that will always be modern and gripping. But Penderecki was absolutely aware of his place in history, and he knew that that style was unsustainable. While his contemporaries thought that his embrace of tradition and bringing it forward was traitorous, history has vindicated him, at least if you agree that art needs to be rooted in the past in order to affect the future. Although he may have passed on, Penderecki will always be a contemporary composer. He speaks so directly and powerfully, illuminating age-old stories and making us feel like we're witnessing tragedy alongside him.